Hello again, Dan Alasso here with another chapter of U.S. History 1. And today we're going to talk about politics and about expansion. Because westward expansion and also war between Great Britain and France in the 1790s were very important in shaping early United States foreign policy. As a new, indebted, and weak military power, the American Republic really had no control at all over European events and very little leverage even in what those Europeans did in North America or in its efforts to trade freely in the Atlantic. George Washington, who had been reelected in 1792 with an overwhelming majority, declined to run for a third term. And that eliminated the threat that his presidency would become a monarchy, and it set a precedent for future presidents. In the presidential election of 1796, the Federalist and the Democratic Republican parties competed for the first time, although the leaders of both parties had claimed that their greatest fear about the new Republican system of government was partisanship. It was exactly these partisan battles over things like the French Revolution and the Whiskey Rebellion that fueled the divisiveness. And Washington's vice president, the Federalist John Adams, defeated his Democratic Republican rival, Thomas Jefferson, by only 3 electoral votes. Adams won the New England and the Mid-Atlantic states, and Jefferson took the South and Pennsylvania. As the loser in this presidential race, Jefferson actually became Adams's vice president. Tickets that included both the presidential and the vice presidential candidate from a particular party began in 1800. And then a separate ballot for vice president was implemented in 1804. And all of this led to the 12th Amendment that dealt with all of these kind of open threads that the Constitution hadn't thought of. This image here is a painting of President John Adams by Samuel F.B. or Finley Breese Morse, who was the son of Jedediah Morse, the geographer who promulgated the Illuminati conspiracy, and had trained as a painter before he developed the telegraph and Morse code in the 1830s. To this new Federalist President John Adams, relations with France were the biggest problem. After the execution of Robespierre and the end of the Reign of Terror in 1794, the French had written a new constitution that kind of backed away from the very democratic ideals of the original revolution and instituted a 5-man committee called the Directory that ruled France from 1795 to 1797. The Directory was continually at war with coalitions of enemies that included the Ottoman Empire, Austria, Prussia, the Kingdom of Naples, and of course Great Britain was a constant foe. And because of that, France issued decrees that any ship carrying British goods could be seized on the high seas. In practice, this meant that the French were targeting American ships, especially in the Caribbean, where the United States supplied the British Sugar Islands. France voided its 1778 treaty with the U.S., and the French and the Americans waged really an undeclared war from 1796 to 1800, with France seizing 834 American ships. President Adams was alarmed by this and urged the buildup of the U.S. Navy, which at the time of his election had consisted of only a single ship. In 1797, John Adams dispatched envoys to try to negotiate terms of peace with France. The French foreign minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, told the Americans that in order to even begin opening negotiations, the U.S. would have to repay all of its outstanding debts that it owed to France from the Revolutionary War, and it would also have to lend France 32 million guilders in Dutch currency and pay a 50,000 pound bribe. News of this French attempt to extract this bribe, which became known as the XYZ affair, turned American public opinion against France. Federalists seem to have been correct in their assessment of France, people thought, while the Democratic Republicans had been misled. At about the same time, rumors began circulating of a German society called the Illuminati, as I've already mentioned, which was accused of having started the French Revolution and was believed to be trying to spread those anarchistic democratic ideals of that revolution back to America. The surge of animosity against France during this undeclared war led Congress to pass several measures that, in time, undermined Federalist power. These 1798 war measures, known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, claimed to be about increasing national security. First, the Alien Act and the Alien Enemies Act gave the president the power to deport new arrivals, new immigrants who appeared to be a threat to national security. This was directed against the imagined Illuminati, but of course there were no Illuminati, so the act expired in 1800 with no immigrants having been deported. It did come back out of mothballs during the First and the Second World Wars, and we've heard a lot about that in the last several weeks in America because the current administration has resurrected it in its attempt to expel foreigners whom the administration is calling invaders. At the time, the more important and controversial act, however, was the Sedition Act that was directed against American citizens and imposed up to 5 years imprisonment and a massive fine of $5,000 on people convicted of speaking or writing, quote, in a scandalous or malicious manner against the government of the United States. 25 men, all of them politicians from the opposition party to the Federalist administration, which was coming together as the Democratic Republican Party, were indicted under that act, and 10 were actually convicted. One of these was a congressman, Matthew Lyon, a representative from Vermont, who had launched his own newspaper, The Scourge of Aristocracy and the Repository of Important Political Truth. Lyon's imprisonment was believed by many to be a flagrant violation of the First Amendment. And so his case became a cause, even for those people who didn't exactly agree with his ideas. So the Sedition Act was understood as attacking the freedom of the press under the First Amendment. Democratic Republicans argued that both of the acts proved the Federalists' intent to squash individual liberties and enlarge the power of national government, which would also crush states' rights. Jefferson and Madison led the response to these Adams administration laws in statements known as the Virginia and the Kentucky Resolutions, which argued that the acts were both illegal and unconstitutional. These resolutions are important for history because they introduced the idea of nullification, which is a supposed right of states to nullify or ignore or invalidate acts of Congress. And this idea, introduced in these resolutions, would later become central to the fight over slavery. This undeclared war with France ended in 1800 when President Adams was able to negotiate the Treaty of Mortefontaine. His willingness to engage in talks with France divided the Federalist Party. But the treaty did reopen trade and ended the French practice of taking American ships on the high seas. In 1800, another very close election swung the other way. Thomas Jefferson won half of Maryland's electoral votes, but lost nearly half of Pennsylvania's. The big differences this time were the split in the Federalist Party caused by Adams' willingness to negotiate with the French and Jefferson's decision to bring New York Senator Aaron Burr on as his running mate. Jefferson was able to win all of New York's 12 electoral votes, which began a long period of Democratic-Republican government. Jefferson called this the Revolution of 1800. And it was the first peaceful transfer of power from one party to another in American history. The presidency passed from the Federalist, John Adams, to his vice president and political adversary, the Democratic-Republican, Jefferson. This transition of political power from one party to another without bloodshed set another important precedent especially after the over-the-top rhetoric of the campaign that included suggestions that this election was an existential risk for the nation, that Jefferson's party was a puppet for foreign powers or for the Illuminati, and that anarchy, chaos, and the end of the Republic would follow a Federalist defeat. This 1800 election was much more divisive than the 1796 election had been, as both the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans waged an intense, nasty, mudslinging campaign against each other. Because the Federalists were badly divided, the Democratic Republicans gained political ground. Alexander Hamilton, who had disagreed with President Adams' approach to France, had written a letter which had been meant only to be seen by a few allies within his party, but which had been made public. And this letter attacked the president's character and judgment, as well as his choices, and ridiculed his handling of foreign affairs. Democratic Republicans happily reprinted this letter, which not only embarrassed Hamilton, but showed the divisions among the Federalists. Jefferson viewed democracy as good for the Republic, in contrast with Federalist views of hierarchy that Jefferson thought of as aristocracy. But even Jefferson's version of democratic participation was only slightly more inclusive than that of the Federalists. It extended only to the white yeoman farmers in whom Jefferson placed so much of his trust. While the Federalist architects of the Constitution feared a pure democracy, a mob rule, and preferred to limit political power to elite merchants and bankers and plantation owners, Jefferson was a little bit more optimistic that the common American farmer could be trusted to make good decisions. Jefferson had cheered the French Revolution and had not really even objected that much when the French Republic had instituted the terror to ensure that the monarchy couldn't return. While in France in the late 1780s, Jefferson had written to another U.S. diplomat that, quote, "the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure." By the end of 1799, however, Jefferson had rejected France because of his opposition to Napoleon's dictatorship. During 2 terms as president, Thomas Jefferson reversed the policies of the Federalist Party and turned away from urban commercial development and early industrialization. Instead, he promoted agriculture through the sale of Western public lands in small, affordable lots in the Northwest Territory, where, you'll recall, slavery was not allowed. Jefferson imagined what he called an empire of liberty extending westward. He distrusted cities and hoped to build a rural republic of landowning white families. He wanted the United States to be the breadbasket of the world, exporting its agricultural commodities and avoiding the social ills created by urbanization and industrial commerce. Men who worked for wages, he believed, were dependents who could be intimidated by their employers into voting for candidates that the bosses preferred. Ballots were not secret during this period. Massachusetts was the first state to adopt a secret ballot in 1888, nearly a century later. Since the American yeomen would own their own land and produce their own food and be self-sufficient, they could stand up against those who might try to influence their votes with threats and promises. Jefferson also championed the rights of states and insisted on a very limited federal government. And he believed in fiscal austerity. Under his direction, Congress ended all internal taxes, such as the ones that had led to the Whiskey Rebellion. The most significant reductions of the federal budget came at the expense of the military. Jefferson didn't believe in maintaining a standing army during peacetime, and he slashed the size of that navy that Adams had worked on building up. Even so, Jefferson did respond to the capture of American ships and sailors by pirates on the Mediterranean coast of North Africa by sending the U.S. Navy to war against the Muslim Barbary states in 1801, and this is the first conflict fought by Americans overseas. This image is of the burning of the USS Philadelphia, which was captured and taken to the port of Tripoli, but boarded and burned by Stephen Decatur and 60 of his sailors. Jefferson actually abandoned his convictions about these limitations of federal action under the Constitution in 1803, when the United States bought the Louisiana Territory from France. Louisiana, which had been a French province since the 17th century, had been ceded to Spain at the end of the French and Indian War, you might recall. Napoleon had reacquired the territory for France in 1800, but debts from his failed attempt to reconquer Haiti, which on the 1st of January 1804 became the second former European colony in the Americas to achieve its independence, and the only nation ever established by former slaves who had fought their way to freedom. The loss of this territory and the prospect of a new war with Britain, which was imminent, convinced the Emperor of the French to give up his ambition to return France to the Americas as a colonial power. Jefferson's diplomats, led by Robert Livingston, had initially approached the French about purchasing only New Orleans, which controlled the Mississippi Delta and as a result controlled shipping from all of the farms in the U.S. interior. When Spain had controlled New Orleans, the U.S. had been allowed to send goods through the port without paying customs duties. Under French control of the city, the U.S. had lost this free port. Jefferson sent Robert Livingston and James Monroe to France to make the offer. The timing was perfect, since Napoleon's plan to make the Mississippi Valley a French-controlled breadbasket for Haiti was failing. In early 1803, Napoleon responded by offering to sell the entire 828,000 square mile Louisiana territory to the United States for $15 million. That's the equivalent of about $500 million today. There was no legal precedent for a president to make this type of deal. And Jefferson had been a strong advocate of limited federal power under the Constitution and believed that realistically, the only way to legally do this was with a constitutional amendment. But there was no time, and the opportunity was too good to pass up. The Louisiana Purchase could help him achieve his vision of the U.S. as an agrarian republic in which yeoman farmers would work the land. So he went ahead with the deal, and he doubled the size of the United States. The decline of the Federalists that began under Jefferson led to more than a decade of one-party rule that historians have called the era of good feelings. Like Jefferson, the next two presidents, James Madison and James Monroe, were both Virginians and were both members of the Democratic Republican Party. Federalists retained regional popularity in the Northeast, but their leadership position, setting foreign and domestic policy, had ended. The only exception to this decrease in Federalist national power was the Supreme Court, where another Virginian, Federalist John Marshall, was appointed by John Adams as one of the very last things he did as president, and became the longest-serving Chief Justice ever. Marshall ran the court for 34 years, from 1801 through 1835. And Marshall influenced the development of the federal government every bit as much as Jefferson. Marshall and Jefferson, although they knew each other from their time in Virginia, were not friends. They didn't like each other. They didn't like each other's policies. And although this one didn't, others of these partisan divisions often flared into violence. The animosity between the political parties exploded in 1804, for example, when Aaron Burr, Thomas Jefferson's vice president, killed the Federalist Alexander Hamilton in a duel. When the Democratic Republican Burr had discovered that he was not going to be Thomas Jefferson's running mate in 1804, when Jefferson ran for re-election and picked another New Yorker, George Clinton, Burr ran for governor of New York, the position that Clinton was giving up in order to be vice president. Burr lost to another Democratic Republican, the Attorney General Morgan Lewis, but he blamed his defeat on Hamilton, who had been quoted in a newspaper article that had been written to discredit Burr. On July 11th, the two rivals met on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River for a duel in which Hamilton apparently shot into the air, but Burr shot Hamilton. Both Burr and Hamilton were younger than 50 years old. There's a little bit of uncertainty about the exact year of Hamilton's birth, but he was 48 or 49. So it's likely that each would have continued to make contributions to American society and to American government if the duel had not ended both of their political lives. Now, of course, one of the main differences between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists was their approach to the economy. One of the main things that the Federalists are remembered for is their support of commerce and finance. And this continued with the ongoing Federalist control of regions like New England, where manufacturing thrived, and, of course, of the Supreme Court. But the growth of business, and especially of corporations, had begun generations earlier. The U.S. Patent Office issued its first patent in 1790 for a process to make potash, that is lye from wood ashes, which enabled settlers making new farms on the frontier to produce a marketable product while they cleared the land. But even earlier in coastal cities, early Americans had developed ambitious plans, some of which were just too big to be financed by individuals. And the answer to this problem had been incorporation. Corporations, during the colonial period, had been quasi-public organizations that had been given a royal charter to do a particular job. The Virginia Company and the Massachusetts Bay Company, you'll remember, had both been royally chartered corporations. They earned profits for their shareholders, but they also had, or at least they claimed to have, important social functions that transcended mere profits. Without this social dimension, businesses, even very large ones, had typically been organized as partnerships or sole proprietorships. But this was very risky for the proprietor, who might sink his entire fortune into a business only to have it fail. To spread risk and to encourage investment, state legislatures in early America continued the English tradition and chartered corporations, initially to do specific tasks in the public interest. Colonial governments had begun this practice very early in American history, when the Massachusetts legislature had established Harvard College in 1636 and then had chartered the Harvard Corporation, North America's very first corporation, in 1650. Corporate influence on the government and society and even the environment actually begins with this original American corporation. In 1640, the Massachusetts colonial legislature gave Harvard College a license to run a ferry between Boston and Charlestown across the Charles River. Charlestown is north of Boston. That's where Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill are, to raise money to pay the school's operating expenses. 145 years later, when the state of Massachusetts granted a new corporate charter to the Charles River Bridge Company to build the first bridge across the river in 1785, the new charter actually specified that the bridge company had to pay the Harvard Corporation £200 per year to compensate the college for the revenue that the old ferry operation was about to lose to the new bridge. The Charles River Bridge was a privately operated toll bridge. Although it had originally been chartered as a quasi-public corporation that would provide a social benefit, the bridge company was a private corporation, and it was wildly successful. The corporation had been capitalized at $50,000, which means that $50,000 had been raised from investors to build the bridge by selling shares. Once it was built, the bridge collected $824,798 in tolls between 1786 and 1827. Although the original plan had been to eliminate the tolls once the bridge had paid for itself, the shareholders instead decided to continue profiting on their monopoly. They voted to continue charging tolls and to pay those profits out to themselves as dividends on their shares. Now, Enriching a few wealthy corporate shareholders at the expense of everybody else was not exactly what the Massachusetts legislatures had intended when they had granted the Charles River Bridge Corporation a charter to build a bridge that would monopolize the river crossing. But although the company had violated the spirit of their agreement with the state, it had not actually broken any laws. So the legislature was in a bind. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts chartered a second corporation, the Warren Bridge Company, to build a second bridge across the river, right next to the Charles River Bridge. Learning from their mistake, the legislature made sure that the new charter would specify that the Warren Bridge Company would only be allowed to collect tolls for 6 years or until the bridge had paid for itself, whichever came first. Then ownership would revert to the Commonwealth and the bridge would become toll-free. Outraged by this challenge to their privileged position as the monopolist of foot and wheel traffic across the river, the Charles River Bridge Company sued the Warren Bridge Company, claiming that their 1785 charter had granted them a perpetual monopoly on traffic across the river. As the legislature that had authorized the new bridge had expected, the Charles River Bridge Company's revenues, of course, disappeared as travelers chose to pay the lower tolls charged by the Warren Bridge. And when the lawsuit failed in Massachusetts courts, the aggrieved plaintiffs took their appeals all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Despite hiring famous orator Daniel Webster to argue their appeal, the Charles River Bridge Company lost. The Supreme Court's decision reflected the Massachusetts court's belief that the profits of the corporation and the interests of its shareholders, while important, were less important and legally came second to the state's authority to charter corporations to meet public needs. Even so, the tremendous profits that had been taken, the nearly $825,000 that they had earned during this period when they were a government-granted monopoly, they got to keep. And their ability to push their lawsuit all the way to the highest court signaled the beginning of a change in the way corporations viewed their roles in society and the responsibilities that went with the rights that were bestowed by public charters. And finally, despite questions and some significant arguments about its constitutionality, the popularity of the Louisiana Purchase helped Thomas Jefferson win re-election in 1804 by a landslide. Of the 176 electoral votes that were at stake, all but 14 went to Jefferson. The Federalist candidate, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, the son of Eliza Lucas and Charles Pinckney, who we've read about before, had strenuously avoided being drawn into partisanship and only won a couple of Federalist strongholds in the North. He was defeated even in his home state of South Carolina. It could be argued that he knew he had no chance against Jefferson and that the Federalist Party was just going through the motions of fielding a candidate. The great expansion of the United States, of course, did have its critics, especially among Northerners who feared both the addition of more slave states and their reduced influence in Congress. Under a strict interpretation of the Constitution, it remained pretty unclear whether President Jefferson had actually had the legal authority to add territory in this way. It was difficult, however, for people who had been enthusiastic about the implied powers of the Constitution that Hamilton had proposed and that they had used when it suited them to credibly object. But most people ignored the inconsistencies and the contradictions that were becoming regular elements of politics and cheered the huge increase in size and in the apparent importance of the new republic. Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark out into this new territory to explore it and demonstrate that the United States knew something about this land that they were claiming. Lewis and Clark went up the Missouri, and then with the help of Sacagawea, crossed the Rockies and followed the Snake River to the Columbia River to the Pacific, and brought back a lot of information. And of course, American expansion into this new territory is a key element of the next couple of chapters of our story. And we'll get to those soon, but that's all for now. So I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thank you very much for listening. I will see you again very soon.